I used to think family was a word wrapped in warmth Sunday dinners, porch lights left on, unconditional love that asked for nothing in return. I clung to that idea like a safety net, even when reality kept trying to tear it apart. I'm Isla. I'm 29. And on the morning of my birthday, I genuinely believed I'd come home to a warm meal, or even just a small note left on the kitchen counter. Something. Anything. Instead, I walked into silence and a packed suitcase sitting by the door. No streamers. No cake. No hugs. Just my mother, Marla, folding laundry at the dining table like it was any other Tuesday, and my father, Gordon, sitting on the recliner with a beer already in hand. Despite it not even being 5 p.m., he didn't look up at me. He didn't have to. I already knew this wasn't going to be a celebration. "You're too old to be living here for free," he said flatly, eyes fixed on the television. "Time you grow up and move out." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because I hadn't heard them before. He'd weaponized the word freeloader plenty of times during drunken outbursts, but because this time it wasn't yelled. It was planned. Quiet. Surgical. My birthday hadn't been forgotten. It had been repurposed as a deadline. I stood frozen in the doorway for a second too long enough for my mother to glance up briefly, then back down at a towel she kept folding and unfolding, like that piece of fabric mattered more than me. I wanted to ask why today? Why now? But I already knew the answer. Because I was convenient. Because they thought I wouldn't fight back. Because I'd made it too easy for them to depend on me for too long. And now, they were done. I'd been living in this house for almost a decade after college at first, to help my mom recover from her surgery, then to cover the bills after Dad's layoff, and eventually because leaving didn't make financial sense. I paid the utilities, split the groceries, even handled the Wi-Fi and car insurance because you're better with numbers, sweetie. I wasn't some jobless 20-something playing video games in the basement. I worked full-time, came home exhausted, and still cleaned the gutters when fall leaves clogged them. And yet, despite all of it, I was still too old to be living here for free. I swallowed the lump in my throat and looked down at the sad little cake box in my hand. I'd picked it up on the way home, a vanilla single layer with "Happy Birthday, Isla" scrawled in uneven red frosting. The cashier, a teenage boy who clearly hated his life, had offered to fix the lettering when I winced. I told him it was fine. I didn't have the heart to admit no one else would see it. I placed the box gently on the kitchen counter. It made a louder crinkle than I expected, breaking the stillness of the room. Gordon finally turned toward me, smirking like he'd won something. "Don't look so surprised," he said. "We've given you plenty of time." My mother still hadn't said a word, just kept her eyes trained on that towel like it was going to come alive. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just nodded once sharp, like a closing door, and walked up the stairs to the room I thought was mine. The walls were still decorated with faded posters from college, books I hadn't touched in years lined the shelf, and a half-zipped suitcase sat in the corner like a silent accusation. I'd started packing weeks ago. Part of me must have known this was coming. I just didn't expect it to feel so cold. I sat on the edge of my bed, the weight of everything pressing down like 100 invisible hands. The suitcase, the silence, the cake, all of it felt symbolic. My life reduced to a few bags and a $20 dessert no one else would eat. The candle inside the box had broken somewhere along the drive. It looked absurd now. One missing flame, one person missing, one family missing. That night, I didn't light the candle. I didn't slice the cake. I just stared at it until the sugar frosting blurred into meaningless shapes behind tired eyes. My chest didn't ache the way I expected it to. It felt hollow, stripped bare. But even in that emptiness, something new began to flicker. Something sharper than sadness. Older than anger. Clarity. Because maybe this wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was finally the truth showing itself, and I was just the last to see it. The thing about sacrifice is no one really notices it when it's quiet. It doesn't scream or demand praise, it just accumulates, like dust in corners you forgot to clean, until one day you're choking on it. That's what my life had become in that house. Years of quiet giving, invisible labor, and unspoken obligations stacked so high that I didn't even recognize the weight anymore. I just carried it because I thought that's what family did. That's what I did. Because I loved them. Because they needed me. Because I thought they'd do the same if the roles were reversed. It started small, like most things do. After college, I moved back home because my mom, Marla, needed help recovering from surgery. It was supposed to be temporary. Just a few weeks, maybe a month. But then Dad Gordon got laid off, and suddenly the mortgage was behind, the power bill overdue, and groceries became a luxury instead of a given. So I stayed. Because someone had to. I picked up a full-time job doing admin work for a local insurance office. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. And I was good at it. My paycheck wasn't massive, but it was steady enough to cover the things they kept forgetting. The first time I paid the electric bill, it was because the lights went out while I was in the shower. When I asked Gordon about it, he shrugged and said, "It must have slipped my mind." The next day I paid it myself. It became routine after that. Every bill that went unpaid somehow became mine. The internet, the gas, the phone plan, even their car insurance. Every month I'd budget carefully, stretch my grocery money, skip dinners out with coworkers, all so I could cover what they couldn't or wouldn't. And no one said thank you. Not once. The thing is, I didn't do it for a thank you, at least not at first. I did it because I believed in family. Because I saw the panic in my mom's eyes when the fridge was nearly empty and the gas gauge was blinking red. Because I knew Gordon would rather let the heat get shut off in January than admit he needed help. I stepped in not because I was obligated, but because I loved them. That was my mistake. I thought love and obligation were the same thing. I thought doing the right thing would eventually earn me a seat at the table, a sliver of respect, maybe even pride. It didn't. Instead, my contributions were absorbed like water into sand, essential but unseen. When the roof started leaking, Gordon didn't call a contractor. He called me. "You're young." He barked from his recliner, beer in hand, while I climbed onto the icy shingles with a hammer and a roll of patch tape. "You've got better balance." When Marla's tires went bald and she spun out on Route 27, I used my emergency fund money I'd quietly saved for my own apartment to buy her 4 new ones. She patted my hand once at the shop and said, "You're such a good girl," before handing me the receipt and the tow truck fee like it was a grocery list. By then, the pattern was set. I covered things. I handled things. I canceled vacation plans so Marla could have a dental procedure she refused to reschedule. I worked overtime to pay off a loan. Gordon co-signed for his cousin and then defaulted on. I cooked dinners, cleaned the gutters, shoveled the driveway at 6 a.m. before driving myself to work, and then again when I got home, because Gordon tweaked his back and didn't want to aggravate it. He had 1,000 reasons for why he couldn't, and I never gave one for why I shouldn't. I did it all. Quietly, repeatedly, and every year, I told myself next year I'd move out. That once things stabilized, I'd go. That they'd understand, maybe even help me pack. But there was always one more crisis. One more excuse. One more bill to pay. I stopped renewing my passport, stopped thinking about grad school, stopped dating because what guy would want to deal with a grown woman still tied to her parents like an emotional life support system? Some nights I'd lie in bed listening to the muffled television downstairs, Gordon shouting at the news and Marla laughing too loud at late-night sitcoms. And I'd wonder if they even remembered I was down the hall, paying their Netflix, powering their lives. But not once had they asked if I was okay, if I had enough to cover my copay, if I had food at work, if I was lonely. They called me selfish once when I declined to lend money to my mom's church fundraiser. I just had to pay for a tire replacement and couldn't swing it. "It's just $50. Marla snapped, like it was pocket change. When I reminded her I'd paid the water bill that month, she scoffed. "You live here for free, Isla. We've sacrificed a lot too." That was the moment something cracked. Not enough to leave. Not yet. But enough to start noticing the cracks I'd been painting over. Enough to realize that in their eyes I wasn't a daughter, I was a resource, a convenience, a buffer against the world they refused to face head-on. And yet, I stayed. Every time I thought about leaving, the guilt whispered louder than logic. "They're your parents. They raised you. They gave you a roof. You owe them." But what they gave me was conditional. A roof with strings, a love with rules, a home that came with a silent contract I never signed, but kept being charged for. I remember one night during a snowstorm. The power flickered, and the heat cut out. Gordon cursed the electric company, drunk and fuming, while I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and used my hotspot to log in to the utility portal. The bill was 2 weeks overdue. I paid it with my debit card. Again. And when the heat kicked back on, no one looked at me. No one said a word. Marla went back to her crossword. Gordon cracked another beer. And I sat there, wondering if they'd even notice if I disappeared or just complain about the Wi-Fi going out again. Looking back, I think I kept hoping they'd wake up and see me. That one day, my mom would look at the groceries I brought home and say, "Thank you." That my dad would hear the furnace kick on and remember that it was me who kept it running. But hoping for that was like waiting for a light switch in a house with no wiring. They didn't change. I did. But the change was slow. Painful. Like pulling out splinters that had been lodged under my skin for years. I started to take note of every transaction, every withdrawal, every favor that turned into expectation. I kept receipts. Not just paper ones, but mental ones, emotional tallies of moments when they could have loved me, could have chosen kindness, but didn't. I stopped calling them Mom and Dad in my journal, switched to Marla and Gordon. Something about that felt cleaner, more accurate, less betraying of the truth I'd been trying not to face. And by the time that birthday came around, when they handed me a suitcase instead of a gift, I wasn't shocked. Not really. Somewhere deep down, I'd already packed up the version of me that needed their approval. I just hadn't put her in a box yet. So yes, when they told me I was too old to be living at home, it stung. But it also felt like confirmation. Like they had finally spoken, the truth they'd been quietly rehearsing for years. I wasn't family. I was function. And I was done. You always remember the moment everything quietly unravels. Not because of some big explosion or screaming match, but because of the stillness that follows the way your chest tightens in a room where you've suddenly become invisible. That birthday evening didn't feel like a turning point. It felt like something had already turned long before I noticed. But standing in that kitchen, staring at two people who used to be my entire world, I knew something irreversible had just snapped. Not in them and me. The table was already set when I walked in. Meatloaf, canned green beans, and boxed mashed potatoes. My father Gordon sat at the head of the table with a chipped glass of whiskey already in hand. Marla was busy rearranging her napkin, avoiding eye contact. The air smelled like artificial gravy and stale resentment. The kitchen lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that cold, unforgiving glow that made even home-cooked food look like television dinner leftovers. I hadn't taken my coat off yet when Gordon barked, "You're late." I placed the cake box on the counter with more force than I meant to. The plastic bag crinkled loudly in the silence. "Worked late," I said, my voice flat. "Had to finish up some reports." Marla didn't look up. She kept fiddling with her fork, like if she focused hard enough on it, she could will herself out of the room. I peeled off my coat and sat down, letting the silence close in around me like fog. Knives scraped plates. Someone coughed. No happy birthday. No card, not even a lousy candle, just the hollow rhythm of chewing and swallowing. Even the meatloaf tasted like obligation. Every bite stuck to the roof of my mouth like plaster. I pushed my food around the plate, feeling the tension build like pressure in a sealed jar. I should have known something was coming. Gordon wasn't the type to simmer quietly. About halfway through dinner, he slammed his fork down so hard Marla flinched in her seat. My spine stiffened as the sound bounced off the kitchen walls. "You're too old to be freeloading," he said. His voice even and premeditated. "It's time you left." For a second, I didn't even register it. The words hung in the air like a bad smell. I blinked and turned to Marla, hoping foolishly for contradiction, for some flash of maternal instinct. But her eyes were glued to her plate, lips pressed so tightly together they'd gone pale. "I pay the internet," I said quietly. "The electricity. Groceries. Half the mortgage." Gordon let out a bark of laughter that felt like a slap. "Paying a few bills doesn't buy you a lifetime stay, princess." That word. Princess. The same nickname he used to call me when I was 5 and tripped over my shoelaces. When I cried into his flannel shirt and he promised to fix everything. Now it dripped with contempt, twisted into something weaponized and cruel. I stared at the plate in front of me. The meatloaf, the mashed potatoes, the clumps of green beans. It all looked absurd. Like a cheap set piece in a play where I'd forgotten my lines. They'd waited for today to say it. My birthday wasn't forgotten, it was selected. Chosen as the perfect day to make sure I wouldn't forget how little I mattered. I pushed my plate away and stood up. My chair scraped loudly across the floor. Neither of them said anything. Gordon just leaned back in his chair like he'd finally won something. Marla kept her head bowed, the curve of her shoulders slumped in guilt, but not enough guilt to open her mouth. I crossed the kitchen and paused by the cake box. The candle had rolled to one side, cracked somewhere along the drive home. It felt symbolic. One candle missing, one person missing, one family missing. I carried the cake upstairs like I was holding a dead bird. My bedroom door closed with a dull thud. I stood there for a long minute, staring at the packed suitcase I'd started weeks ago just in case. Part of me always knew this day would come. I just thought I'd be the one to choose it. I sat on the bed and stared at the cake on my nightstand. The cheap plastic window was fogged from condensation. Through it, I could see the crooked red frosting. Happy birthday, Isla. No exclamation point, no joy. Just red letters sliding slightly from the buttercream. I didn't touch it. I didn't sing to myself. I didn't cry. I just sat in that room while the rest of the house carried on like I was already gone. The television clicked on downstairs. Laughter from a sitcom spilled through the vents like poison. And I realized this wasn't my home. Maybe it never had been. It was a place I slept, paid for, and patched together. But it wasn't mine. I stared at the cake for what felt like hours. Then, without thinking, I shoved it off the nightstand. It hit the carpet with a dull thud, frosting smearing against the fibers like a bruise. I didn't even flinch. It wasn't an act of rage, it was resignation. Happy birthday. The silence in my room pressed against me like a second skin. I took off my sweater, folded it neatly over my suitcase, and sat down again. My hands were steady, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was done. I had reached the kind of clarity that doesn't scream or sob, it just burns clean. Downstairs, I could hear Gordon open another beer. Marla murmured something I couldn't make out. They were fine. As if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't just gutted me on the one day I allowed myself to hope for something different. I picked up my phone and stared at the lock screen. No messages. No missed calls. Not from them, of course. But not from anyone else, either. Birthdays are funny like that. They reveal who actually shows up. This year, the list was empty. I walked down the stairs silently, out of habit, like I didn't want to disturb them. They didn't even notice me standing in the doorway. Gordon was halfway through his beer. Marla sat like a ghost on the couch, eyes glassy and distant. Maybe a part of me still hoped one of them would look up. That Marla would say, "Wait." That Gordon would remember who had kept the lights on when the checks bounced. But they didn't. Gordon glanced at me over the rim of his can. "Don't forget to turn the lights off when you leave," he slurred. "You're not paying for them anymore." I didn't answer. Didn't scream or cry or beg. Instead, I let the silence wrap around me like armor. I turned and walked back upstairs, each step slower than the last, like I was sealing a coffin behind me. At the top, I paused, pressed my palm against the doorframe, and let myself breathe. Not because I was scared. Because for the first time in years, I knew I was leaving. And this time, I wasn't coming back. There's a kind of quiet that comes after betrayal, not the kind that soothes you, but the kind that sharpens you. It's the kind of quiet where your mind stops spinning in circles and starts laying bricks, building something cold, precise, and permanent. That's where I found myself, sitting on the edge of my bed, surrounded by chipped paint, peeling corners of childhood posters, and a cake smashed on the floor like a metaphor I didn't need explained. The anger didn't come in waves. It came like a tide that never receded, and under it, something colder had started to bloom. Strategy. I didn't cry. I didn't scream into a pillow. I didn't call a friend to rant. Instead, I stood up, opened my laptop, and logged in. My fingers moved with the kind of confidence that comes from years of repetition: bill pay systems, auto-debit portals, service provider dashboards. After all, I was the one who set them all up. Not Gordon. Not Marla. Me. Because I was the responsible one. The good daughter. The one who knew how to keep the heat on and the lights working. But tonight? Tonight? That ends. First up. Electricity. I pulled up the account. My name was at the top, just as I expected. I'd been the primary account holder ever since the year Dad forgot to pay, and we spent 2 nights in February sleeping under every blanket we owned. I hovered over the Remove Payment Method button, my finger twitching once before I pressed down. A confirmation screen popped up. I clicked Submit. Done. Next was water, then gas. Same process, same icy calm. Cancel autopay, delete debit card, confirm changes. Each click was a severing. An invisible thread cut loose from a house that had never loved me the way I deserved. Then came the cable. The internet. Hulu. Netflix. The cell phone add-ons they insisted we bundle together to save money. I disconnected everything. By morning, they'd be staring at blank screens, wondering why their episodes wouldn't load. I paused for a moment, glancing down at the yellow legal pad in my nightstand. I grabbed a pen and started a list. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to see it. I wanted to see, in ink, everything I had been providing for years that they thought just magically appeared. Power, water, heat, phone, insurance. Next came the joint savings account, ironically titled Emergency Fund, in my mobile banking app. I had opened it when Mom's second surgery drained their retirement. I thought naively it was the adult thing to do. Back then, I still believed that helping them would be temporary, that it came with an expiration date. But like everything else in this house, the timeline kept moving, and the thanks never came. I transferred the remaining funds into my personal account, one I'd opened last year and never told them about, just in case. Even then I'd felt it coming. The distance, the resentment, the unspoken truth that I was worth more to them plugged into the system than standing outside it. A few taps later, I froze the joint account completely. No withdrawals, no transfers. It would take days, and my approval to unfreeze it. And they weren't going to get it. By now it was close to midnight. The house had gone still except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the muffled clink of a bottle hitting the sink. I imagined Gordon finishing off his last drink, completely unaware that the world he leaned on was quietly folding in on itself. I imagined Marla sitting on the couch, tired and oblivious, still wrapped in her refusal to intervene, to defend me, to love me openly. I wasn't doing this out of revenge. I was doing it out of necessity. I was done patching holes in a boat that they refused to admit was sinking. I opened the insurance portal. Next my plan, of course. Gordon's truck, Marla's Camry, both covered under my policy for years because it just made more sense for me to handle it. I'd saved them hundreds a month, probably thousands by now. But that wasn't my responsibility anymore. I removed their vehicles from the plan. I left mine. When the confirmation email arrived, I stared at the subject line for a moment. Policy update confirmation. It felt like more than insurance. It felt like a shift in identity. I wasn't the safety net anymore. With every service I shut down, every dollar I pulled back, I felt lighter, not euphoric, just less burdened. Like taking off a backpack you didn't realize you'd been carrying for a decade. The silence around me changed, too. It wasn't suffocating anymore. It was clean, focused, deliberate. I opened another tab and pulled up the shared Amazon account, my Prime membership, my credit card, but their wish list, their address, their orders. I disconnected it, deleted their profiles. Marla's labeled Mom's Cozy Pics, and Gordon's simply G. It didn't even sting. Just another click. Another door closed. I looked at the list again. Every item scratched out was a service they depended on. Every checkmark was proof that they didn't support me, they were supported by me. Silently. Completely. And now that support had an expiration date. A few minutes later, a text buzzed on my phone. It was from Lena, my cousin. No words. Just a meme of a dog sitting in a burning house with the caption, "This is fine." She always had impeccable timing. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I needed this moment to be mine. This night, this quiet revolution was something I had to live through alone. I sat back in my chair, eyes burning from the screen light, muscles stiff. I wasn't tired, but I was exhausted. There's a difference. This kind of exhaustion comes from years of standing in for broken systems and calling it love, and now, I was done performing CPR on a family that flatlined long ago. I opened a blank email draft. Typed in the subject, "You asked me to leave. Now so has my support." Then I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. A full minute. Maybe longer. My fingers hovered, heart knocking lightly against my ribs. I didn't hit send. I didn't need to. The silence I'd been given tonight was more than enough response. They didn't deserve an explanation. They deserved the absence they chose. When I finally closed the laptop, it made a soft clicking sound. Final. Precise. Below my window, the wind picked up, rattling the siding, carrying the brittle sound of dried leaves skipping across the driveway. The town was sleeping. The streetlights buzzed faintly. Somewhere out there, Gordon and Marla's world was about to change. Not with a bang, with a quiet click. When they woke up, they'd find the heat gone. The television unresponsive. The Wi-Fi dead. The grocery card declined. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I refused to keep suffering for them. They told me to leave, so I left. Not just the house, but the role, the obligation, the illusion. That night, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the shadows stretch across the walls like ghosts slipping out of the corners. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant, but I felt still. And for the first time in years, stillness didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. And in that silence, something stronger than anger settled inside me, something I could build on. Tomorrow, I'd leave the house. Tonight, I'd leave the version of me that believed loyalty meant setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. The next morning felt like walking through a different dimension, same walls, same peeling wallpaper, but a different gravity. It pulled at my chest in a new way. I was awake before sunrise, heart still hammering from the night before, a quiet ache in my bones that felt like both release and recoil. Downstairs, I heard nothing. No coffee brewing, no drawers slamming, no Gordon barking about morning news. Just silence. But I knew that wouldn't last. By 7:15 a.m. my phone buzzed. Once, twice, 12 times. I didn't even need to look to know who it was. Gordon. Marla. A few unknown numbers, likely neighbors. Maybe extended family I hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't answer. I just sat there on the edge of the bed, phone screen glowing with chaos while the house remained perfectly still. The first voicemail was from Marla. Her voice, always syrupy when she wanted something, was shaking. "Hi, honey. There must be some kind of mistake," she started. "We woke up and nothing's working. I mean, we know you're upset, but this isn't like you. Please call me back. We can fix this. We're family. We're family." That line felt like a hook baited with memory and reeled in with shame. For years, they'd let that word carry all the weight in the relationship. Family as in, you're not allowed to say no. Family as in, you owe us unconditional support, even when we give you none. The word didn't mean what it should have. Not anymore. Another buzz. A text from Gordon this time. "You'll regret this. Turning your back on your own parents? We gave you everything. You're just proving what we always suspected, ungrateful." Ungrateful. I stared at that word until the letters blurred. For a moment, a knot twisted in my stomach. So familiar I almost welcomed it. That pit of doubt. The fear that maybe I was the villain in this story. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had gone too far. But then I remembered. I remembered the winters I paid the heating bill while they watched television with space heaters blowing on their feet. I remembered the night I skipped dinner for a week, so I could afford Marla's new prescription without her having to bother with insurance paperwork. I remembered the nights I cried alone in my car before walking in with takeout and a smile. I wasn't ungrateful. I was exhausted. Still, guilt has claws, and they know exactly how to sharpen them. Throughout the day, the messages piled up. Cousins, distant aunts, people who had been ghosts in my life suddenly appeared with opinions. Isla, this is your mother you're doing this to, one read. Think about her heart. Another. Family fights. That doesn't mean you cut them off cold. That's cruel. Cruel. Another word tossed at me like a stone. They weren't asking what had happened. They weren't asking if I was okay. They didn't want context. They wanted compliance. And it was working. By noon, I found myself pacing Nora's tiny apartment, phone in hand, messages unread. She was at work, and I was alone, surrounded by furniture I didn't own and a life I hadn't built yet. It would have been so easy to walk it back. To call, apologize, say it was a misunderstanding. Plug the router back in, reinstate the auto-pays, pretend none of this ever happened. But pretending had cost me too much already. I sat on the couch and opened the latest voicemail. Marla again. Her voice warbled, soft, soaked in what she wanted me to believe was remorse. We didn't mean to hurt you, baby. Your father's just under a lot of stress. He didn't mean what he said. He hasn't eaten since yesterday. He's not sleeping. He's sick over this. Please, Isla, be the bigger person. Mari. I let the phone fall onto the couch next to me. Be the bigger person. That phrase alone made my hands clench. I had been the bigger person every single day for a decade. I had been the peacekeeper, the provider, the fixer. I'd paid their bills and patched their wounds and excused their behavior because they were family. And now that I'd stepped away, suddenly I was heartless. I needed air. I stepped outside into the crisp Ohio wind, the kind that bites just enough to make you aware of your skin. Autumn was in full swing, leaves skittering across the sidewalk, the scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. The world looked untouched. Ordinary. I felt like the only one mid-collapse. Then, my phone buzzed again, this time a message from Lena, my cousin. It was short, brutal. Uncle Gordon just told Aunt Marla to fake chest pains next if the guilt trips don't work. I stopped in my tracks. It was like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water over my spiraling thoughts. All the guilt, the doubt, the worry that maybe I was the one burning bridges, it all dissolved. So that was the game. Not apology, not reflection, just manipulation, dressed up in panic. I sat down on a park bench nearby, phone clenched in my hand, the wind threading through my hair as I replayed the message again and again. Fake a heart problem? That's where we were now? If they couldn't guilt me into returning, they'd simulate a medical emergency? No more. This wasn't love. This was control. And I was finally seeing it for what it was. I walked back to Nora's, my steps more deliberate now. When I got inside, I tossed my phone onto the table and didn't touch it for hours. Let the calls come. Let the texts pile up. I wasn't interested in performance anymore. I wasn't interested in being cast as the villain in their morality play. Let them talk. I made dinner. I organized my things. I listened to music that didn't remind me of home. I lit a candle and wrote in a journal I hadn't opened in years. And in those small, defiant acts of reclaiming normal, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. It didn't last long. Peace never does in the aftermath of escape. By the next morning, the town Facebook group was buzzing. Carrie, a former coworker, sent me a screenshot. There it was, Gordon's latest performance art, front and center. Some daughters are raised to be grateful. Some grow up into snakes. After everything we sacrificed, she left us starving and alone. Please pray for us. 100 likes. Dozens of comments. Some offering prayers. Others throwing digital stones. Ungrateful. Selfish. Shameful. The knot came back, fierce and hot in my chest. I stared at the post, shaking, while the phone buzzed again, this time with screenshots from neighbors, old classmates, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were supportive, others were cruel. I read the names of the ones who judged me, one by one, and I realized they weren't angry that I had stepped away. They were angry that I'd done it publicly, that I'd interrupted the narrative, that I hadn't gone quietly into the role assigned to me. Gordon had turned the town into a jury, but he'd underestimated something important. I had the receipts. I didn't respond. Not yet. Let them talk. Let them spin their version. Because I knew that eventually their story would crack. And when it did, I wouldn't need to scream over them. I'd only need to speak once. And speak with truth. Until then, I sat back, hands still trembling, but heart a little steadier. Because now I knew. Their love came with terms. And I was no longer in the business of accepting conditional contracts. There's a difference between being silent and being silenced. For most of my life, I thought staying quiet was the noble thing to do. That letting things slide, rising above, biting my tongue, that was maturity. That was loyalty. But sitting there in Nora's apartment, phone buzzing with judgment from strangers and acquaintances alike, I realized silence had never protected me. It had protected them. It had allowed Gordon and Marla to rewrite history with the sharp edge of shame and the soft pull of guilt, all while I swallowed my truth to keep the peace. But peace bought with silence is not peace, it's permission. And I wasn't giving it anymore. The moment I saw that Facebook post, "Some daughters grow up into snakes," something in me clicked. Not snapped. Not broke. Clicked. Like a lock turning. Like a door opening. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even reply. I simply got up, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and pulled the dusty gray file box from under the bed. It was heavier than I remembered, not just in weight, but in meaning. This box held 10 years of proof. Years of bank statements, utility bills, auto insurance summaries, repair receipts, grocery runs, medication copays, all in my name. All paid with my debit card. All conveniently forgotten by the people now calling me a monster in a public thread. I sat at Nora's kitchen table, the overhead light casting long shadows across the paperwork as I began organizing the chaos of my contributions. I didn't do it out of spite. I wasn't building a revenge post. I was building a record. A map of truth. A timeline of the life I'd silently poured into a household that now denied me so easily. Each paper I laid down was a memory I hadn't been allowed to keep. Electricity under my name since 2016, when Gordon forgot to pay and the heat cut off in the middle of a January blizzard. I'd used my own money, skipping rent on my college apartment, to get it turned back on. Water paid for every month since 2017, when I found the shut-off notice taped to the front door, and Marla just smiled and said, "Well, I figured you'd take care of it." Oh. Internet funded through my account, right down to the router installation fee I'd covered because Gordon didn't want to wait on hold for 2 hours. Mortgage half of it, quietly wired from my account into theirs, because I was told it was just until Dad gets back on his feet. He never did. But my payments never stopped. I stacked it all chronologically, methodically, until the kitchen table looked like a crime scene built out of paper cuts and forgotten favors. Nora walked in halfway through, her eyes widening at the sheer volume. She didn't say anything at first, just poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me, watching. "You're really going to post it?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Not angry. Just factual," I said. "If they want to tell a story, then so do I. But mine's going to have evidence." She nodded. "Let them bury themselves with their lies. You've got the shovel." Oh. By late afternoon, I had a clean folder of scanned documents ready to go. I opened a new post draft, not on my personal page, but in the same town community group where Gordon had slung his half-truths and martyr complex. I didn't use dramatic language. I didn't insult them. I didn't even mention their names. I simply posted what I had. First, I uploaded screenshots of utility bills in my name, dating back nearly a decade. Each one with a timestamp. Each one linked to their home address. Then a handful of emails with landlords and contractors verifying I had paid for roof repairs, window replacements, a new water heater, all from my account. All done because Gordon didn't want strangers poking around the house, and Marla wasn't good with that kind of paperwork. Then came the bank transfers clean, documented, consistent, thousands of dollars over the years, for groceries, medical emergencies, car repairs, birthday gifts for them, gas cards during the pandemic, utility assistance every winter. I included a short paragraph. I've stayed silent for a long time, not because I had nothing to say, but because I hoped someday they'd say it for me. But today, I'm speaking not out of anger, but out of necessity. When I was asked to leave, I didn't just lose a place to live, I lost people who had quietly erased me for years. So here's the truth, not dressed in opinion, but printed on statements. I didn't abandon them. I sustained them. And when I stepped away, they finally noticed because the support stopped. Not because the love did. I hit post. For a moment, the world felt still. Just me, Nora, the low hum of the fridge, and the faint smell of fall drifting in through the cracked kitchen window. Then my phone lit up. Once. Then again. Then again. It didn't stop. Comments started rolling in. At first, a few local teachers, old classmates, neighbors. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Reactions flooded in. People shared the post, tagged others. One neighbor commented, "I remember seeing her shoveling snow alone while her dad stood on the porch yelling at the plow guy." Another, "Funny. Gordon used to brag at the VFW about how he hadn't paid a utility bill since his daughter got her first paycheck." It turned out people had been watching. They'd seen more than I thought. They'd remembered. The narrative shifted. What had started as a campaign to shame me was unraveling. And they couldn't stop it. Because I hadn't used emotion. I'd used facts. They'd shouted their version. I whispered mine with proof. Gordon tried to respond. He posted another status, brittle and defensive. "We all make mistakes. Families fight. My daughter is exaggerating things for attention. It's sad, really." But the comments beneath it weren't buying it anymore. "Exaggerating? She posted your utility bills. Funny how none of this came up until she stopped paying for your stuff. Gaslighting your kid doesn't make you a victim, it makes you pathetic." Even people who had once sided with them began to quietly backtrack. Marla stopped posting altogether. The silence that followed felt like retreat. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. Because none of this should have been necessary. I shouldn't have had to post my personal financial records to justify walking away. I shouldn't have had to relive every moment I sacrificed, every dollar I spent, just to prove I wasn't cruel. But the truth is, when you stop being useful to toxic people, their love curdles into hate. And when that happens, they don't fight for you. They fight to control the story of you. But not this time. I shut my laptop and leaned back in the kitchen chair, the weight in my chest a little lighter. Not gone, but manageable. Across from me, Nora raised her coffee mug. "To survival," she said. I lifted mine. To never apologizing for it. That night, I didn't sleep easily. The adrenaline had faded, but the grief lingered. Grief not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd never truly had. A home that felt safe. Parents who saw me, not just what I provided. A birthday that wasn't laced with conditions. But grief is honest. Guilt is manipulative. And I was finally done living under guilt's roof. I always thought the worst they could do was stop loving me. But apparently, the worst was never hatred. It was weaponizing the law to punish me for walking away. 2 days after I posted my truth, the knock came not frantic, not loud, but deliberate. A series of 3 slow raps against Nora's apartment door that immediately made my chest seize. I wasn't expecting anyone. Nora was still at work. I opened it hesitantly, expecting maybe another relative come to plead or preach. Instead, I found a uniformed officer holding a large manila envelope. His voice was even, professional. "Isla Marin?" "Yes," I said, even though my throat felt dry. "You've been served. Civil suit. Contact information's inside if you have questions." I nodded, numb, and closed the door gently behind me. For a long minute I stood there, staring down at the envelope like it was ticking. I already knew who it was from. I didn't even need to open it. And yet I did, hands trembling slightly, mind reeling not with panic, but a strange, icy clarity. Inside was a copy of the complaint. Gordon and Marla were suing me. The charges? Financial abandonment, theft, emotional elder abuse. At first I laughed, a short, bitter sound that startled even me. Because if it weren't so cruel, it would have been absurd. The same people who lived off my bank account for years were now accusing me of stealing from them. The same people who never once said thank you were calling me emotionally abusive. I sat at the kitchen table, rereading the document under flickering light, rage simmering beneath my skin. It wasn't even the lawsuit itself that hurt, it was the message behind it. They didn't want to resolve anything. They didn't want to talk. They wanted to erase what I'd said. Silence me. Scare me back into submission. They wanted the version of me who apologized for existing. They didn't realize she was gone. By noon, I was on the phone with a legal aid clinic in Columbus. I explained everything calmly. Precisely, no tears, no dramatics. Just facts. I sent them every document I had scanned. Utility bills, payment receipts, bank records, the Facebook post where Gordon implied I was a snake, and screenshots of every text, voicemail, and backhanded threat I'd received since. On the other end, the paralegal listened in silence. Then said quietly, "You have a very strong case. Honestly, it sounds like you should be the one suing." That. I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought beyond defending myself because I was still conditioned to just endure. But they were right. What had happened to me wasn't just unfair. It was a form of exploitation, coercing adult children to provide unpaid labor, unreciprocated support, and unconditional emotional service under threat of guilt and isolation. It had a name. And it was a pattern more people lived through than talked about. With their help, I filed a counterclaim. I didn't do it out of spite. I wasn't looking to destroy them, but I was done letting them write the story of me as some vengeful child. I was done letting them use shame as a shield. I filed formal documentation outlining financial coercion, manipulation, and emotional labor under duress. I included timelines, figures, screenshots, statements from former neighbors, and even my boss who remembered me taking time off to replace Marla's tires and work overtime to pay down Gordon's debt. That night, I told Nora everything. She didn't say much, just listened, then poured me a glass of wine and said, "It's about damn time someone stood up to people like them." And the hearing wasn't for a few weeks, but word spread fast. Our town didn't need court transcripts, it had Facebook and church gossip. I stayed quiet, refusing to give fuel to the fire, but people were already piecing it together. One of Gordon's co-workers posted anonymously in a community thread. "Funny how the guy screaming about elder abuse also brags about never paying his own utility bills." 2 days before the hearing, Marla called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice soft and watery. "You're tearing this family apart, Isla. Your father's not well. We only wanted what was best for you. Please, stop all this before it's too late." I replayed it once, just to be sure I'd heard correctly. "We only wanted what was best for you." No apology. No acknowledgement. Just more of the same story, one where I was ungrateful, disloyal, destructive. An hour later, Gordon texted, "You think you've won? Family always gets the last word." I stared at that message for a long time. It was such a strange thing to threaten me with family as a curse, not a bond. Family as the hammer they planned to hit me with again and again until I stayed down. But not this time. The morning of the court date, I stood in front of the mirror in the guest bathroom at Nora's place, hands steady as I zipped up the navy blazer I borrowed from her closet. I didn't feel powerful. I felt ready. And that was enough. At the courthouse, the room was small. A low ceiling, flickering fluorescent lights, and gray walls that looked like they hadn't been painted since the 82nd. Gordon sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, jaw clenched, eyes hard. Marla beside him, her face set in a mask of sadness she thought might win sympathy. I didn't look at them. When my name was called, I stood tall. Calm. The truth didn't need theatrics. My legal rep laid everything out clearly, professionally, unemotionally. The judge asked questions. I answered each one with a document to match. When Gordon tried to interrupt, claiming I was twisting everything, the judge raised a hand and said, "Let her finish. You'll have your turn." He didn't like that. When it was their turn to speak, Gordon ranted. Marla cried. They claimed abandonment, disrespect, emotional harm. They painted a portrait of me as a selfish daughter who turned her back on two aging parents who sacrificed everything for her. But the judge wasn't moved by tears. He was moved by proof, and I had plenty of it. When the hearing ended, nothing was decided yet. But the tide had shifted. Even Gordon could feel it. His hands shook as he stood, his face red. He muttered something to Marla, who clutched her purse and looked away. Outside the courtroom, the legal rep turned to me. "You did well," she said. "Don't let them manipulate you. You have every right to protect your peace." "Bye." I nodded, staring up at the courthouse steps. The sun was bright, almost too much after the dim courtroom. But I didn't shade my eyes. I let it hit me full on. It was the kind of cold, clear air you only get in early November, the kind that stings but wakes you up. I wasn't smiling, but I was standing, and I wasn't scared anymore. They tried to rewrite me out of their narrative, but I was writing something new. Freedom doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It's not loud or cinematic or accompanied by any great ceremony. It slips in quietly, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. I didn't walk out of that courthouse triumphant. I didn't cry or laugh or collapse with relief. I simply walked, down the cold concrete steps, through the crisp November air, into a world that had always existed but for the first time, felt like it belonged to me. No one was waiting outside. No cameras. No cousins ready to whisper shame into my ear. Just fallen leaves and the sound of my own footsteps, and that was enough. Back at Nora's, I didn't say much. I peeled off my borrowed blazer, set it carefully over the back of the chair, and made myself a cup of tea. Something herbal. Comforting. She didn't ask what happened. She just handed me a blanket and sat nearby, her presence a kind of quiet applause. I was too tired for storytelling, but inside me, something was shifting. That night, after she went to bed, I found myself standing at her window, looking out over the quiet street below. Porch lights blinked across the neighborhood. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, in a house not too far from here, a daughter was probably being guilt-tripped for forgetting to unload the dishwasher. And someone else, maybe like me, was deciding whether to speak up or swallow it again. I leaned against the window pane and exhaled. This time I chose me. 2 days later, I signed the lease for a small studio apartment downtown. It wasn't fancy exposed pipes, cracked tiles in the bathroom, a heater that made a low groaning sound when it kicked on, but it was mine. Every square foot, every imperfect corner. I painted the walls pale blue, the color of open sky and exhaled breath. I bought secondhand furniture from a thrift store. A wobbly kitchen table, a sun-faded couch, a chipped mug that read, "Best daughter ever," which made me laugh out loud when I saw it on the shelf. The first night I slept there, I didn't dream of them. I dreamed of silence, of space, of possibility. While unpacking the last box, I found it the tiny plastic birthday cake topper from the night everything broke. I held it in my palm, the cracked candle still bent slightly to one side. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I felt whole. That cheap little decoration wasn't a symbol of loss anymore. It was proof that I'd lived through it, that I'd survived the fire without burning down who I was. I placed it on a shelf above my desk, not out of nostalgia but out of honor. Not to remember what they did, but to celebrate what I didn't let them take. Weeks passed. I rebuilt my life in small, intentional pieces. I cooked simple meals. I started journaling again. I went for long walks without needing to report where I was going or who I was with. I applied for jobs in new towns. I stopped flinching when my phone buzzed. And when it did, I only answered when I wanted to. One morning, a card appeared under my apartment door. No return address. Inside was a small note, written in delicate handwriting. "You were never the problem. Some people just fear the ones they can't control." I never found out who sent it. I didn't need to. because I already knew the truth. Family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by behavior and respect and the absence of fear. Real family doesn't treat your boundaries as betrayal, they honor them. They celebrate your growth even if it means growing away from them. I wasn't bitter, I was better. Not perfect, not healed all the way, but free. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see a woman who saved herself, who walked away from the narrative that was written for her and picked up the pen. And maybe someone out there needs to hear this. If choosing yourself feels like betrayal, you were probably never loved conditionally to begin with. Walk anyway. The story of Isla is a powerful reminder that love without respect is not love, it's control. Many of us, especially in adulthood, are taught that family means sacrifice, even at the expense of our own mental health and autonomy. But the truth is, loyalty does not mean tolerating emotional manipulation or being the invisible backbone of people who only see your worth in what you provide. Isla's journey shows us that sometimes the most courageous act isn't confrontation, it's extraction. Walking away isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It's the quiet decision to stop pouring into a well that never gives water back. This story invites anyone who's felt erased, used, or guilt-tripped by those closest to them to consider this. Boundaries are not betrayals, they are acts of self-respect. And choosing yourself, even when it means losing what's familiar, is not selfish, it's survival. True family, chosen or biological, will never make you question your worth. They won't demand your silence to stay comfortable. Sometimes healing starts not with forgiveness, but with a locked door, a canceled bill, and the sentence, "Not anymore." And from that quiet ending, something real, something free can begin.